Greetings, YouTube. One of my subscribers, Feline Alage, whose name I am probably butchering and I apologize, asked me a while back about blunt weapons and polearms. Well, today I'm going to talk about blunt weapons because I think these two topics are kind of large for a single video. And I'm a big fan of blunt weapons. I mean, there's over my shoulder, you can see that Tetsubo leaning against the wall, an iron staff or iron club, which I myself made. It was my favorite Japanese weapon of all time, and my YouTube nickname. Yes, I'm aware that I'm not pronouncing it in the exact proper way for Japanese. It's my name, I can do what I want. And hanging right above, right there, those two round objects you see hanging in the background, that is a set of bolas, which I purchased recently at a thrift shop. And one of the rarities you could find anywhere in the world or in a gaming system, a blunt or bludgeoning throwing weapon. They're not too common. But it is true that often blunt weapons are given the short end of the stick, if you will. They're not portrayed accurately. They're not given as much impact as they deserve, because they were very common. Vastly more common than swords were. There's a reason for that, because for the most part they were a lot easier to construct and often were tools as well as weapons, whereas a sword is a tool that is just a weapon. And a lot of the time you end up with things that look like this. This is a cast aluminum, a solid cast aluminum wall hang, kind of a vaguely reminiscent of something you might find from like the Germanic eras of the late Middle Ages. I got this from a neighbor who had it. I think he got it as part of a junk lot or something. This is strictly a wall hanger. It's not really a functional weapon, and it's oversized. It's overly dramatic. The real one would have been much smaller than this, but even this is much smaller than a lot of blunt weapons that are shown in gaming books. A lot of them are hugely oversized. They look like things out of comic books, like Mjolnir you see used by Thor in the Marvel comics. Massive weapon that would have never been used by anybody other than a god. But this just, this is kind of goofy looking. I collect weapons, so he gave it to me. Much more realistically, if you're going to talk about hammers, is something like this. This is an actual blacksmith's hammer. I don't know the particular name for this hammer. I bought it at a barn sale years ago. And I purchased it specifically because it is very similar to what an actual war hammer would have looked like as far as size and mass. And I can also use it as a hammer if I choose, though I'm not doing a lot of blacksmithing here at my home, though I have done a little in the past. Also, along the same veins of somewhat realistically, now this is a pick, but this right here, you'll see, is squared off, and it's got these 4 little points. And those 4 little points are designed so that when you swing it against on a piece of armor, it's going to be less likely to slide off and more likely to bite in. And this is the kind of thing you would have seen on an actual warhammer head. This is also obviously a pick. And lest you think that this is just a toy, there is a solid steel shaft that runs down the entire length of this piece of bamboo, so it's kind of misleading, which is obviously the point. It's actually a threaded rod which was lubricated with epoxy. It's never coming out. And it's one of probably my favorite goofy weapons I own, which is kind of nice. A friend of mine made it for me. But it makes an excellent penetration for armor, which is what this is all about. Hitting someone in armor. Now, one of the reasons you wanted a blunt weapon for hitting someone in an armor is that you're not worried about ruining your edge like you are with a sword. In a sword, you're really looking for gaps in the armor. With this, you can hit the armor itself, and if this hits and it doesn't slide off, it's likely to dent the armor. Now realize there's a person inside that armor. So if you can dent the armor into their body, that dent doesn't go away. You are now literally impacting their ability to move and function. And if you hit them in the head, you could be doing crippling damage that puts pressure on something you don't want pressure put on that doesn't let up. You may even have crumpled the helmet to the point where it cannot be removed to save their life, which means they're no longer on the battlefield, and that's the point. But there are also other types of blunt weapons that are not really given a lot of play. This is just a nightstick, though it's got a hole here, which is really poorly chosen because it's gonna. If you hit something low, I think you're very likely to crack this. That should really be here. I'm not sure why it was designed that way. I picked it up at a yard sale somewhere. But the classic size and shape of a nightstick, very effective, cheap to make, and if you have the wherewithal and the training, you can throw these things. Clubs were used as throwing weapons, and there were clubs designed as throwing weapons. They tended to have a more bulbous shape and often had a slight point to one end, and obviously they flew in an asymmetric manner. If you did not actually get a straight shot, if it was a short distance to someone near you, and they were very effective as throwing weapons. And in the Polynesian islands, quite frequently, a blunt weapon might have been carved from stone and would make an effective throwing weapon as well. In fact, I've even seen examples in burial crypts that were found that were made of solid jade. Obviously ceremonial, and we put it in with someone who was very high-ranking socially, but let's face it, it's still a blunt weapon, and it would have been devastatingly effective if you hit somebody with it, particularly if they're not wearing heavy armor, which you wouldn't find in a lot of South American or Polynesian cultures. They weren't wearing a lot of metal because they didn't have it, so they were wearing things like bark and rattan and things like that for armor, leather, wood, which did not take the blow as well as, of course, iron or steel or bronze would. Then you have something like this, which is a classic Excrema stick. This is made out of rattan, which is a variety of very similar to bamboo, except it's solid. And one of the nice things about rattan is that I don't know if you can see this in here. No, it's really hard to see, but rattan is actually comprised of many, many thin tubes, essentially. And if you break rattan, it kind of turns into a piece of broom. So it's not likely to snap off and harm the user. It just becomes kind of floppy and no longer effective. It's one of the reasons that the SCA uses it, because it's not likely to snap off like, say, a piece of oak or really hardwood and then become a sharp edge. Could be a disadvantage, could be an advantage. It depends on what you're using it for. But if properly seasoned and chosen as a good quality, they're very effective as impact weapons. And apparently, this particular one belongs to the Daredevil. Another one we have here. This is known as a tire thumper. I have a couple of different varieties of these, and this is known as a hickory tire knocker, which is actually used to knock tires to see if they are properly inflated on a truck. If you hit the tire, one that is not properly inflated will make a different sound than one that is properly inflated. This one has a steel pin that comes in here, which gives it a little more oomph. And in gaming terms, this could be considered to be a club, or even maybe you might construe it as a light mace of some variety. And of course, then we have the classic nunchucks. These are really nice hardwood with spiffy swivels. I have never used them for anything. I picked them up at a yard sale for, I believe, $10. They were in very nice shape. It was a nice buy. I also bought a bow staff from the same person, which I did not get out of my closet to show you because it's just a bow staff. You know what a bow staff looks like. It's not all that interesting. One of the things that I find amazing about these, now obviously these are very well made, and in a gaming term, say for D&D or Pathfinder, they would be considered masterwork in their quality. But the original nunchucks, and I have it set over there to practice chuck, which is just wood with rope connecting them, is very similar to a real set of chucks, which were threshing tools. They were designed to, you use them to strike grains, rice or something else, to separate the chaff from the part that you want to keep. In European parlance, the chaff from the wheat. Just like what a flail was. The original flails were threshing tools. The European ones tended to be two-handed with a shorter head, so you just... Or these were one-handed, and you're boom, boom. But it's a similar concept. And there isn't any particular reason that these are any more exotic than a regular flail, because they're a flail. That's what they are. They're a threshing tool. That was turned into a weapon because the people that possessed these as tools were forbidden from accessing military weapons, so they used what was available and built fighting styles around that. There you go. This is a flail. I also have the makings for an actual two-handed flail here at my home, and at some point in the future I plan on doing a video about the absurdity of the dire flail. But we don't give blunt weapons really a fair shake, and you should have that in a game. They were useful in the real world. They were ubiquitous. Maces of every variety, one-handed light, one-handed heavy, and two-handed maces were all available. That's what a tetsubo is, folks. It's a two-handed mace. And I have a two-handed mace that I've checked. I've made myself. Checked both of my videos, crafting with tetsubo, and crafting with tetsubo heavy mace. And I've actually used the heavy mace as an exercise tool. I have since upgraded to a sledgehammer. And a sledgehammer is also another tool that could be used as a weapon. It would be the classic maul, though it'd be very difficult to swing in combat. If you connect with something, it's going down. And if you hit someone in the chest or helmet with a sledgehammer, they're probably not getting back up again. Of course, you're very likely to miss. Even a guy in heavy plate is going to be able to dodge that unless they're severely distracted. But I think that we need to give blunt weapons or bludgeoning weapons more time on the battlefield, more use in the game. I would like to see more characters that were built around them, not just they're simple weapons or they're unsophisticated basic weapons, so they should only be used by people who aren't trained, but real warriors used them. Warhammers and maces were used by knights, and a lot of maces had geometric style heads. The Russians were great for geometric style heads on maces. Some of them were complete works of art, and some of them were flanged and only barely qualify as blunt in any definition, because you get these big pointed flanges on them, again designed to prevent them from slipping off armor and from making deep impacts. And if you hit someone in chainmail with the blunt weapon, the chainmail is not going to protect them as much as it will against a sword blow, because it's going to blunt the impact a little, but it's not going to dissipate that energy completely, because you're just going to push the chain into the person's body, giving them a nice waffle effect if they live. And I would love to see games treat these more realistically. For example, I think that the Great Club should be upgraded in D&D to a die 12. Make it a blunt version of the Great Axe. What the Tetsubo should be, a two-handed mace or two-handed war club, something like that. And it is a viable option. And during the Greek era, it was one of the few true two-handed weapons you had access to, which was a war club, because you weren't making two-handed swords out of bronze. They were going to be one-handed weapons, because you just couldn't make bronze that large to be structurally sound and still be usable. Though you could make thrusting bronze swords, and in fact the Celts even had one that looked very much like a rapier. And it kind of like an estoc in some ways, but not quite that large. Sorry, I got off the tangent there. But I would like to hear people's opinions about what do you think we should be doing with blunt weapons in role-playing games. Do you think that they're seen often enough? Do you know of a system that really pays attention to blunt weapons and gives them the credibility they had in the real-world battlefield? I'd like to know. And I hope that this fulfills my subscribers' request.